Have you ever had a neighbor who thought they could outsmart you? I mean, the kind of person who treats the suburban lawn war like it's the ultimate championship? Well, I've got a story about the guy next door, Mr. Jensen, who tried to pull something so bold on my front yard that I nearly fell off my porch chair laughing, and then, yeah, I wasn't about to just let that slide. So there I was on an otherwise usual Saturday afternoon, just sipping my coffee and watching the neighborhood go about its very suburban business. And then I spot it, a little contraption laid out right in the middle of my freshly mowed lawn. It looked like a bizarre science experiment, some string here, a couple of cans balanced precariously, and what I swear was a motion sensor jury-rigged from a leftover garden sprinkler. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I'd accidentally edged into a sci-fi movie set. That's when the nightmare, or comedy depending on how you look at this, clicked into place. Mr. Jensen was up on his porch, arms crossed like a kid caught plotting mischief but trying real hard to act innocent. It was a trap, no doubt about it. Who sets a trap on someone else's lawn? Apparently he did. At first I thought maybe he'd lost his mind, but nope, he was dead serious. The man was so intent on catching me tiptoeing through his petunias or whatever it was he thought I'd do, that he'd sprung this whole elaborate setup just yards from my front door. Honestly, it was kind of impressive in a what fresh madness is this kind of way. But here's the kicker, I wasn't going to be outfoxed by Mr. Jensen's garden gadgets. Nope, not this time. I shot him a grin that said, "Game on," and quietly started plotting how to turn this prank back around on him. Because if there's one thing suburban life teaches you, it's that when the neighbor tries to outsmart you, it's usually just the first move in a very long game. Adios. Jensen. That was the name I stonewalled next to every suburban showdown we accidentally signed up for. The guy was, well, something else. Retired military, I'd heard through the grapevine, which probably explained the whole tactical lawn surveillance thing he apparently thought was a perfectly normal hobby. He worked overtime on making sure his house looked like the cover of some pristine home magazine, shrubs trimmed with surgical precision, flower beds boasting petals of every vivid hue, and his lawn? I swear you'd have sworn it was an emerald carpet rolled out just for him. Now me? I'm more the let things be type. My grass grows a little wild, my flowers have this unintentional bohemian vibe going on, and my mower probably sees daylight once every 2 weeks if I'm lucky. That easygoing style, well, it was basically an invitation to Mr. Jensen's competitive streak. Our personalities weren't just on different wavelengths, they might as well have been from different planets. I remember the tension building slowly, almost like a simmering pot you forget about until it starts to whistle. It started with little things. The first time he outdid me, it was his mailbox. The neighborhood standard was pretty generic, but Jensen? No, his was this gleaming, custom-painted box with a little solar-powered light that made it glow at night like some high-end Vegas sign. I hated to admit it, but the day I walked past and saw that thing shining in the dusk, a tiny spark of envy flared. So, naturally, I swapped out my bored old mailbox for a fancier one the next week, but not before he noticed and gave me that smug smile like he'd won the first round of some quiet war. Then came the garden flags, the holiday decorations, the garage organization contests, each little contest tipping from friendly into something downright awkward. That's when things started to get interesting, or I guess, frustrating. Mr. Jensen would casually drop by with his latest trophy to show off, or leave little passive-aggressive notes about maintenance standards in the communal parking lot. I'd fire back with my own subtle digs, like reducing my lawn's edge to a charmingly rustic mess right next to his flawless stripes. What really cooked this rivalry into the neighborhood gossip stew was the 4th of July barbecue last summer. I showed up with what I thought was a killer playlist and a batch of my famous ribs. Mr. Jensen? Oh, he went full culinary ninja, the kind of setup that made the whole block want to RSVP just to gawk. He had string lights everywhere, a fire pit shaped like a tank, yes, a tank, and some grilled octopus that looked suspiciously fancy for a neighborhood potluck. I swear, even the dog seemed skeptical as it circled his yard. That evening, I realized this wasn't just neighborly rivalry. This was about pride, about who could be king of our little suburban castle. And honestly, part of me was amused, maybe even a little proud that it was me he'd zeroed in on. Oh, but the other part? That's the part that gets restless when you know a prank or a trap might just pop up on your lawn next. Neighbors started choosing sides too. Little whispers over fences, informal alliances during block parties, friendly jabs disguised as compliments. Some thought it was hilarious. Others, like me, were a bit more wary. Mrs. Peters from 3 houses down firmly planted her flag with Jensen, claiming his garden was a masterpiece of discipline. Meanwhile, Tom from across the street just shook his head and handed me an extra beer, muttering, "You'll need this soon." And then, just as I thought things might simmer down or at least pause, Mr. Jensen started hinting at something big. He wasn't just content with better mailboxes or tactical flower arrangements anymore. No, I caught him muttering to himself over the hedge while fiddling with what looked like an elaborate battery of garden gadgets and strings. The kind of contraption that didn't just say, "I want to win," it screamed, "I'm about to raise the stakes beyond anything you've seen on this block." That was when I felt it. The familiar mix of adrenaline and that stubborn refusal to let the guy have the upper hand unchecked. Whatever he was planning, it was going to be serious, and, well, I wasn't about to just sit back and let my lawn become the stage for his next big stunt. This game wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mr. Jensen was gearing up for his biggest play yet, and here I was, already sharpening my wits for the move that would remind everyone why, on this quiet street, you never count a neighbor out so easily. So, here's where things started to get downright entertaining, or, depending on your perspective, a bit exhausting. Mr. Jensen, fueled by whatever competitive fuel happens to power retired military lawn obsessives, began unveiling these little pyramid schemes of pranks aimed squarely at outsmarting me. And not just your garden variety cheeky stuff, no. They were increasingly elaborate, each one upping the ante like some suburban showdown version of chess. The first one hit me on a Sunday morning. I'm out in the backyard, minding my own business, when suddenly I hear this series of loud clangs coming from the front. I hurry to investigate, only to find that he'd rigged a sort of tripwire setup along the path leading up to my door. It was something like a Rube Goldberg machine, triggered by unsuspecting footsteps, eventually setting off a cascade of whooping party horns balanced on flower pots. I stared, a mix of disbelief and amusement washing over me before chuckling under my breath. Honestly, it was impressive, the patience and creativity, if not the common sense. Naturally, I couldn't just let that slide. But instead of going for some immediate payback, I played it cool for a bit, feigning ignorance while secretly plotting. I mean, I had neighbors watching, a sort of neighborhood audience that seemed equally amused and invested. Over the next couple of weeks, there were whispered conversations during the weekend barbecues and occasional nods or chuckles when I passed by. Side-taking was inevitable. Some people thought Jensen was hilarious, a prankster keeping us all on our toes. Others, like Tom from across the street, kept raising their eyebrows when Jensen's next stunt showed up on my lawn. Then came the infamous garden HOA audit. Jensen somehow convinced Mrs. Vieses, Peters, and a couple of other stalwart supporters from the block to take a casual stroll around my property, supposedly checking on things like grass height and weed proliferation. Yeah, I know, it sounds absurd, but I could see Mr. Jensen hiding behind his trusty hedge, notebook in hand, taking notes like he was preparing an official report. The whole thing ended with a polite but pointed note slipped under my door the next day, suggesting that some standards might need reconsideration. The nerve. By this time, I was no longer just amused. The game had turned personal. It was clear Jensen thought he was closing in on some decisive victory, like he was about to claim the title of undisputed king of the block. But I wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. I started keeping an eye out for anything he might have been cooking up next, stepping up my own silent countermeasures. Small things like subtly rearranging his garden flags when he wasn't looking, or amusingly retuning his sprinkler system so it drizzled in completely unpredictable patterns. These little skirmishes didn't go unnoticed. The neighborhood buzzed quietly, with some folks dropping by just to witness the unfolding rivalry. A couple of friends would nudge me with teasing smiles, whispering, "That Jensen guy is seriously entertaining." Meanwhile, I'd catch Mrs. Priest's Peters shooting me one of those looks that said, "You're an infuriating opponent," but with a hint of reluctant respect. And then, one evening, as twilight blanketed the street and most of the neighbors had retreated indoors, I caught Jensen out by his garage, tinkering with what looked like his tallest and most complex setup yet. Several strings connected to weighted cans, a motion sensor of some kind, and even a remote-controlled element that I swear was designed to deliver some sort of surprise package right onto my porch step. He muttered to himself about finalizing the plan, practically vibrating with anticipation. That was the moment I realized this wasn't some casual prank competition anymore. Mr. Jensen was gearing up for the biggest stunt he'd ever pulled in this mini-war. And if I'm honest, I felt that twisted mix of nerves and excitement you get right before a showdown. Because now it wasn't just about lawns or mailboxes. It was about who could outsmart who, in a game where the whole neighborhood was watching. So there I was, standing just beyond my front window, watching the man next door preparing for what might be the move to end all moves. It felt a bit like waiting for a storm to hit, except this storm was armed with garden gadgets and a rigid sense of suburban honor. I had to ask myself, how do you turn the tables on someone who's convinced they've already got the winning play? Well, let's just say, I wasn't planning on being caught off guard, not this time. The night before Mr. Jensen's grand final prank, I barely got any sleep. Not because I was worried, no, more like I was too wired, spinning ideas in my head like a casino roulette. I knew this guy like a well-thumbed book at this point. His setups had this weird mix of meticulous military precision and the desperate enthusiasm of a guy who really doesn't want to lose. I figured I could use that against him. So, when the morning light finally crept through my curtains, I was ready. The moment he triggered the motion sensor, expecting some grand surprise to unfold on my porch, it didn't go the way he thought. From behind the scenes, I was already on deck with my countermeasure, a cleverly rigged decoy involving a mirror, a smartphone, and a pre-recorded booming voice message of mine that said, "Warning! Intruder alert! Intruder alert!" It was loud enough to startle not just Mr. Jensen but half the block, and the mirror, placed just so, reflected his own elaborate contraption right back at him in the most humiliating way. I'll never forget his face. The mix of confusion, frustration, and unmistakable respect flickering across it as he scrambled to figure out what the heck just happened. Then, the neighborhood erupted into a chorus of chuckles and cheers. Mrs. Peters nearly fell off her chair laughing. Even Tom raised his beer in a slow, approving salute. That moment was more than just my victory lap. It was this weird turning point where all the petty rivalry suddenly felt a lot less like a war and more like a shared joke between two guys who cared enough to make the block a little more interesting. After the dust settled, Mr. Jensen actually came over, not with a glare or a snide remark, but with a cautious grin and this slightly awkward shrug. "You got me," he said, hands in his pockets, looking less like a competitor and more like a neighbor. I'll admit, I didn't see that coming. I laughed and clapped him on the shoulder, feeling that strange but welcome sense of camaraderie. Neither did I. Guess we both learned a thing or two. From there, things mellowed out gradually. The traps disappeared, the passive-aggressive notes became more like friendly wave, guys in the neighborhood had one less rivalry to gossip over. Not that it ever really died, just changed shape. Sometimes, when you least expect it, the battles that seem the fiercest open up spaces for understanding instead. So, what would you have done in my place? Because the truth is, sometimes the best wins are the ones you don't see coming and the kind that don't leave anyone feeling like a loser. And hey, if this whole suburban saga has taught me anything, it's this. In the end, it's less about outsmarting your neighbor and more about having a story worth sharing, preferably with a wink and a smile.